Hello and welcome to the Inside Risk and Compliance podcast. I'm your host, Adam Spencer, Director of AJ Fox Compliance, a specialist recruitment agency focusing on all things law firm risk and compliance. I have seen so many people carve amazing and fulfilling careers in this space, and it really has been a pleasure speaking to people who enjoy doing what they do every day. However, one thing that has really stood out to me is how hard it can be for people to access the bigger picture outside of their team, outside of their firm. We created this podcast to share with you some of the insights, experiences and stories of the most interesting people succeeding inside risk and compliance. Today we spoke to James Rickett, Global Lead for Anti-Money Laundering and Sanctions Compliance at the ICA. I really think you guys are going to enjoy today's episode. James has a knack of bringing things to life. We spoke about all sorts of things, including sanctions and sanctions compliance, the role of the regulator, and whether fines are just part of the cost of doing business. Enjoy. So James, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you for having me. Are you well?
I'm very good. I'm really excited to have you on here.
Thank you.
So we've done a bit of an intro, but I know you've had an interesting career path. So from what I understand, you've gone from sort of mortgage advisor into AML investigator in the Middle East, now course director at the ICA. It would be super interesting if you could just give our listeners a bit of a sort of plotted history of your career path and how you've got into the risk and compliance world in the first place.
I could give a short answer, and some of that would be luck or right place, right time. But I guess you've got to get yourself in that situation. Mm-hmm. So regulatory side of things started quite a lot of years ago now. Mm-hmm. Mortgage advising practice in the UK. That went on for a couple of years. Did one or two roles in between. That took me out to the UAE, mm-hmm. and my role evolved to become like the mortgage compliance officer, if you like, in the UAE, and that's really where, although I had the regulatory understanding and the knowledge, that's where I really started to get in the juicy and interesting stuff.
Was that out of? Did you decide to take that route? Did it sort of come to you? You didn't know anything about it?
A bit of both, really. Yeah. I know we were talking about this just beforehand, but the perception of compliance around the world greatly varies. It's very mature in some jurisdictions, and it's not as mature in some jurisdictions, and it transpired the firm I was in at the time, it was going through a lot of regulatory focus globally because of some previous misdemeanours, and as a result the role evolved into the compliance aspect, and then that took me into investigations, and that was super interesting, looking at the really juicy, interesting stuff. I will bust a myth though. Being an AML investigator isn't all about catching money launderers or terrorists. You see hundreds, if not thousands, of just normal stuff that we just can't get an answer for that isn't really financial crime. Mm-hmm. But you do get the odd case, and then that springboards you. But that was a pretty critical window for me in terms of my development. So that's really the learning the fundamentals of customer activity behaviour, how transaction monitor influences the ability to understand customers, CDD, and then of course that's really in a bank your first foray into external partners and stakeholders such as financial intelligence units and central banks and regulators. But arguably the biggest point of that period was my first foray into professional qualifications. Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of people that wanted my seat, wanted to be in that seat because who wouldn't want to be called an investigator? But it's about how you differentiate yourself. And I had when I saw the land of financial crime, and should I say anti-financial crime? I didn't want to be a financial criminal, obviously. It was about separating myself because there was a lot of people with a lot more experience. Mm-hmm. That was it. That took the first qualification. As that role evolved over a course of years, I'm not sure why people thought this, but they seem to think I could talk, and I don't know. I don't know where they got that from. And that's where sort of the team I was with at the time wanted to do some training. Yeah, I was actually asked by the senior management to develop the training. I got then accredited by the ICA to train because the company I was with employed them, and a little while later there was some contact, and then I find myself in the role of a course director, focusing sort of the anti-money laundering sanctions CDD space. As that role has evolved over the last couple of years, I've now become the global, well, I say now, 2.5 years, 3 years, global lead for anti-money laundering and sanctions compliance. So my day-to-day role is exceptionally varied. The best part is, without question, I get to speak to some of the brightest, most amazing compliance professionals and leaders that we have now, and also some of the brightest minds that are going to become compliance leaders and leaders in the anti-money laundering space. And my role in that is so many facets. There's the awareness thing like we're doing today. The big part of my role are qualifications and speaking on those qualifications. And I'm very privileged in the sense that I get to listen to so many opinions that allows me to form opinions, whether they're controversial or good or even bad, and impart that and develop, depending on what somebody's want to do, a compliance professional's career. So there are so many other strands to it, but everybody has that right.
That sounds awesome. So when you made that first transition originally, what was it that made you decide that, I want to stay in this space? This is for me. I'm going to progress a career in the world of compliance.
Well, there is an element of glamour, isn't there, to working in anti-financial crime? And I think initially that was you're a bit of a pedestal. People always want to listen to crime stories and financial crime, and we all know about it. We've seen Breaking Bad and Netflix and all the films and stuff. Where maybe I sort of saw things in a different light, I actually started to appreciate the impact that the decisions, regardless of the role of what you do in the institution, actually can have on not just the socioeconomic issues around the world or protecting the organisation, but you think, bloody hell, like, I'm making a decision that could be saving a life.
Yep.
It sounds really cliche and a little bit cheesy, but I don't care. Like, it's what I truly believe in. There's something I speak about even to this day. It does not matter at what level you're attempting to undertake a qualification. You will make a difference, and if we go on this journey together, you'll benefit. People like to be in compliance because it pays nicely, or it's got the aspirations to do that, or they want the ethical considerations. So why not have the best of both worlds?
No, that sounds amazing. I mean, it was actually a question I wanted to come on to later, but we may as well come on to it now. I know you'd said that you speak to a lot of, I mean, we talked about legal professionals, but I'm sure it's professionals in all sectors who want to do the right thing. But they don't necessarily understand the impact that they can actually have on society. So can you bring that to life a little bit in terms of how they can have that positive impact, what they're preventing, and sort of connect the two things? Because I think you're right, people often forget that massive connection.
So we're talking about here the connection between what they're doing and actually the bigger impact.
And preventing terrorism and you know.
Okay, I'm going to, if I may, can I walk us through a real life scenario?
Do it, yeah, that'd be amazing.
Now, everybody that is playing this and might have seen me speak at a course have heard me speak this hundreds of times, but I always get asked to talk about it, so I'm going to, and I think that will resonate the issue. But you need to play along.
Okay.
So if my accent didn't give it away, I'm from the north of England. For any international viewers, about an hour and a half away from Manchester, which will know the football teams. But the Manchester bit's important. So although I don't live there, it's quite easy to commute there. But in Manchester, ironically, in the shadow of a prison where there's some pretty nasty people, there is a street. The street is affectionately known as Manny Market. And as I call it Manny Market, the people that are in the north will be laughing because they think only they call it that. But now I've spread that news around the world. What's quite interesting about this market is that there are shop fronts that all have rather nice designer clothes and bags and everything. But on closer inspection, and it doesn't take much closer inspection, they're all fake. So we're going to go on a journey, and what I hope to achieve on the outcome of this journey is awareness about what you've asked about the decisions that we make and how they impact them. And I will use lots of different sectors to be part of this journey, so law firm, banks, and so on. And then we as human beings, so even if somebody's watching this that isn't a compliance officer but wants to be, they could actually go back to their families and say, wow, don't do this or do this. Before I take us down this journey, I need to put a disclaimer in at this point. The disclaimer is, if you or if our colleague that's in the studio with us or anybody watching this has ever participated in this, knowingly or unknowingly, I'm not accusing them of this. And that's recorded, right? So that'll be the disclaimer.
Yeah.
So you and I, because we're going to rise and fall together, we're going to buy a bag. Do you have a particular favourite brand or even
I've
clothing?
got a bag under the table that my sister bought me. I don't know what the brand is, but it's big and it's very practical. It's probably not a designer brand.
Well, let's just pretend.
Let's imagine it's like
let's
Gucci
pretend
or
it's
something.
Gucci.
Yeah? Okay, cool. Yeah,
let's
got a
pretend
Gucci
it's
bag.
a Gucci bag.
I saw you had a nice bag when you came in.
Well, thank you. So back to your bag, our bag.
Yeah. Okay.
We've now got this bag, and it's a Gucci bag, and it retails for £50. $50, whatever we want to do. We know it's fake. The first question I have for you is, where do we think that bag was manufactured? And before you give me the answer, remain fact-based. So think of a jurisdiction that has a substantial export industry of textiles.
So just a bag, I'm imagining maybe it could be in Bangladesh, in India, in China. It could be anywhere around the world.
Perfectly rational response. Jurisdictions that are well known for their textile exporting. So, thanks to AJ Fox, we're going to get on a plane paid for by them, and we're going
to check with my accountant.
Well, okay, we better do in the spirit of doing the right thing.
Okay.
But we land at the factory.
Yeah.
So we've landed at the factory in one of these jurisdictions, and the reality is, the people that are making that bag are not going to be individuals who you would expect to be treated in a professional work capacity. So my question is, what kind of individual would you expect to be working in these kind of shops?
So now you're getting worried it's going to be children.
Okay, so we're going to take this down that route. And likely it's going to involve some modern day slavery, maybe some smuggling of individuals, maybe human trafficking. I don't envisage that they will be treated like humans. I can't even believe I'm saying that, but that's the reality. Let's pause for a second. First of all, we've got fraud, we've got IP breaches. There's going to be money laundering because we've got an asset now that's moved around, and the asset clearly carries a value because it'll have moved in thousands of units. We're at the factory, and now we're talking about child labour, slave labour, modern day slavery, human trafficking, migrant smuggling. It's going to get worse. How would that container or that shipment of bags reach the United Kingdom?
Oh goodness, I don't know. Smugglers.
But, well, think about how much you're moving. So you're moving a room.
Maybe even through a legitimate company, but unknowingly.
Well, so thinking quite practically. So it's going to go in on a boat, isn't it? Or it's going to go in a plane. But I see what you're saying. Yeah. So now we're talking about smuggling. We're talking about getting these goods. Now, something like 200 to 250 million containers around the world move each year. About 1 to 2% are checked, and I think the source of that's the UNODC. Right. So it's not a statistic I've made up. It exists. And if any of you viewers find the source, please share it in the comment section. Now, in order to facilitate that movement of product, this is where, at this point, a organised crime gang are going to have to employ the services of a bank. Now, in order to be taken seriously by that bank, because you can't just walk in and say, I need to move a container, they're going to need to set up a company. Now, that company is going to be created by a legal professional, by a trust corporate service provider, and it's going to need to have that air of legitimacy. Now, as the Panama Papers did, Pandora Papers, it has shone the spotlight into the murky world that is trust corporate service providers in the legal sector.
Yep.
So they've now created a company, hidden and wrapped themselves inside the ownership structure. That company is not going to be used for legitimate purposes. They've now got the buy-in of the bank, who facilitate trade finance. And if you consider trade finance, let's look around the room. Hardly any of this stuff will be manufactured in this country. It's going to be imported. That's the significance of trade finance. So now we've got different sectors being abused. Now those products have got to move, like we said, through cargo, through sea or air freight. But they're not just going to keep going backwards and forwards, because that would be quite easy to be picked up. It would take one container to be found. The company would be reported to FIUs, etc. So it's going to move around different countries. It's probably going to move through jurisdictions that have weaker, or a perception of weaker, border controls, where they can bribe people.
Yeah.
Now we've got a whole new sector. We've now got shipping involved. We've now got security services involved. So we're really touching onto a diverse range here. They're going to pay bribes. Now, everybody knows the socio-economic damage that bribery does and corruption does. But yeah, we're not going to do a 101 on that. But now, this is where it gets the nasty bit. And the nasty bit is the bit that I go back to my disclaimer. A lot of these routes are controlled by terrorist organisations, and terrorist organisations will sell counterfeit goods to benefit and raise funds for their causes. And brings us to Paris.
Mm-hmm.
We're in Paris, the day of the Charlie Hebdo attack, and the group that committed the act of terror raised funds through counterfeit goods sales.
Wow.
So when you ask me about the impact that it makes, you could be a professional in one of those many different sectors across those different jurisdictions, or you could be a friend or a family member or someone that wants to innocently buy a pair of sunglasses or a bag because they want to look good on the gram or Snapchat or whatever it might be, and that's the damage it causes. So there's loads of things to learn. Regulations have a role, training has a role, knowledge, awareness. There are so many different facets. If you can't be inspired by that, I'm not entirely sure what you can be inspired by.
Well, that's an amazing way to illustrate it, and I think that's just fantastic to be able to tie that all together and make it so sort of lucid. So yeah, thank you for that. That's that's amazing. Obviously, there's so many aspects to the puzzle in terms of solving it, and we haven't got time to go through all of them. But as global lead for anti-money laundering and sanctions at the ICA, I thought maybe we could ask you to define at least a small part of it. So can we maybe now talk about sanctions? What are sanctions, and how do they help us in combating these issues?
So we have sanctions and sanctions compliance, and what the reality of sanctions is almost a diplomatic tool to coerce or force change of a regime that is not complying with the standards as a globe that we want to set.
Yeah.
So whether that is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, whether that's genocide, whether that's war, whatever that might be. Now, the jury is always going to be out there whether or not sanctions actually work. Because a country can have a specific sanctions regime and another jurisdiction might not. And why governments really like sanctions is, of course, there is evidence that it works in certain occasions, but it's cheap and it's a diplomatic tool. And if you want to influence foreign policy, what better way to do it than imploring a sanction? Of course, the other aspect is it's also a public declaration of condemnation against a specific actor or individual or group. As I say, there are lots of examples of it working, but sanctions do also have unintended consequences as well. Where they don't work, or they actually hurt the people that they're designed to help. And there are examples of things like Syria, North Korea, Iran, where we know that civilians have also been impacted by those decisions. That's the context of it.
Yeah.
The interesting part is it is not immune to any sector. So every sector has to comply with sanctions. And even the three of us in this room now, we have to comply. And that's that. It's a legal tool, and there's no questions asked. When it comes to sanctions compliance is not only our legal obligation to comply with those, but it's about the set of controls that we must have in order to help us comply. Yep. And a lot of those controls overlap with other areas of financial crime, like anti-money laundering, like fraud. So the mechanism of CDD and transaction monitoring all have a role to play. Screening all has a role to play. So we don't want to conflate the two issues of the legality of a sanction and how we manage sanctions compliance in our organisation. I think what everyone has had a bit of a baptism of fire over the last couple of years is that sanctions are now impacting us personally, with the view of rising gas energy prices. And there is so much more focus now across sectors because of misdemeanours. And in fact, there was a wine merchant in the UK that was fined because they inadvertently advised a target how to make a payment that they wouldn't have been able to make because of their sanction. So sometimes it can happen unintended and sometimes it can happen intended.
So do you have a view on what makes a good sanction or a good application of a sanction versus a bad application of a sanction, or is that getting too deep?
I don't think there's an example of a good and bad. Are we talking from a government policy?
So you were talking earlier about how there's negative consequences sometimes to the application of sanctions.
Yeah.
Is there something that determines that? Is it?
So I do have I've got a couple of examples, but I want to bring in a bit of a humanitarian flavour to it. I think that's the emotive bit that touches us the most. There was a horrific incident in Turkey, Syria a couple of years ago, the earthquake that was globally publicised. Now, the challenge and the complexity that created was that because of the sanctions regimes against Syria, it almost immediately brought a question up of, well, how, as a global community, are we going to get aid in to support them? Because it's extremely complicated. You can't just start sending money. you can't just start sending stuff. It's just not how it works. Turkey was a little bit easier on the other hand. Now, this particular part of Syria was historically a tribal area for ISIS, and a lot of the sanctions against ISIS have actually helped them almost crush down to nothing. So one of the good things about a sanction and how you can manage sanctions is that one of the major authorities of the world, the US, major enforcers, issued a license, and that license was to help get aid in, to help human beings.
Yeah.
The unintended consequence was that you can't always control where those funds go. And there are allegations and rumours that some of those funds were diverted into the pockets of ISIS. That's inadvertently helped them sort of start to rise from the ashes a little bit more than they have in recent years. Iran's another example. We understand why, because of their vocal willingness to use nuclear weapons. But then COVID hits, and then all of a sudden, when we're struggling to get aid in, medical supplies and masks and vaccines, that impacts civilians. Of course, we have seen with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I just want to be respectful of the term conflict. I use the term not to discredit what is happening, but merely just a description of how I'll refer to that.
Yep.
Sanctions have been very powerful in bringing the global community together to force the change of a regime that's inciting war. So the politics side of it will always be open to debate, and there are some amazing people out there that will talk about this on LinkedIn. I would ask everyone to form their own view. We still have the headache of the sanctions compliance bit in our place of work and the challenges around that. So, again, qualifications and so on play a role in that.
I just wanted to take a moment out to thank our amazing sponsor, the International Compliance Association. The ICA are the leading professional body for the global regulatory and financial crime community, offering professional qualifications, world-class events and training. Go check them out online, and if any of the certificates or courses take your fancy, then you can get 10% discount using our code AJFox10 at checkout. I wanted to talk a little bit about the regulator as well, or regulators in general, because I know you have views about regulators.
Yeah.
And one of the things I wanted to discuss, which we'd sort of talked about previously, was the question of, are we being impeded by the regulator? Is the regulator or the regulation, is it controlling us? Or do you think fines are now becoming just sort of business as usual? Are we secretly happy to pay these fines?
Wow, okay. So I have spoken about this and I have shared views. I thought they were in private, but now they're surfacing. So I'm all for it. Look, I think it's worth pointing out the evolution and I'm going to call it a revolution.
Okay.
The revolution of great work that regulators are doing, even in the time I've worked in compliance, has been incredible. Even in the last few years, the work that regulators are doing around the world is fantastic. There will always be, can they do more? And yes. And the reality is, where do you even start? Now, financial services, with regret, tends to be the target of a number of these regulatory enforcement actions, which is understandable. They're some of the biggest sectors. They move the most amount of money. The transaction volumes are the highest. Even the data with the intelligence units say that banks tend to be the biggest filers of potentially suspicious activity. The challenge is, and where I struggle to get my head around sometimes, is that over the course of 2012 was a bit of a landmark. That was the big the first big fine that came out and invoked so much change.
Which one are we talking about?
That was the HSBC fine.
Okay, yeah.
So it's not. I'm not betraying anyone at HSBC.
Yeah.
Netflix made a documentary. It's very well publicised. The Department of Justice were involved. A 5-year monitor, big fine, lots of remediation, fundamental shift in culture in the organisation, and absolutely they have. Now, there's other organisations and other firms that have become repeat offenders, and then you sort of start to become a bit pessimistic about the whole thing, because you start to think, well, there is a lot of extremely sizable fines. We peaked at 8.9 billion with BNP Paribas, and some of the repercussions on them were much deeper in terms of the organisation, significant. We've seen banks in the Nordics that have experienced some of this, and it kind of gets to a point where you think, well, a lot of fundamental changes happened and cultural changes happened. Are money laundering fines now just becoming the cost of doing business? And the way that I reflect upon that is, fraud in a business, organisations will make provisions for fraud to happen in the organisation.
Mm-hmm.
They'll say, we're willing to pay that. At some point, there's got to be a situation where the role of senior management becomes so heavily focused and scrutinised that accountability needs to start taking place. Now, we could go really deep into the intricacies of this. I don't think we've got time to do that. But are we going to get to a point where we see a senior manager actually go to prison because of the actions that happened under their leadership? So it is a bit of a pessimistic view, and I don't necessarily have an answer to that, and I think everyone should form their own view. But it's a question that should remain rhetorical. Yeah. Are fines just now becoming the cost of doing business, or does the evolution of enforcement now need to become the revolution of enforcement, and something substantial needs to happen? But that leads on to a bigger problem. Why would I want to become that senior person if my head may roll down a hill because of a decision that was made under a previous regime?
I mean, it's an interesting one. Is it just the cost on the basis that if, until people are going to prison, technically speaking, it is, whatever way you look at it, it is a cost, right? And I guess the question mark is, if you can make enough money, then is it a cost worth, other than a moral view that it's the wrong thing to be doing? If there isn't any other penalty, it is legitimate. However you define it, whatever way, it is a cost that comes off a balance sheet as we spent this much on fines, but we made this much. So do you think that does the threshold need to be lowered for prison sentences?
Well, maybe I need to add some substance behind why I'm making this statement, and maybe that might inform a view. Organisations, understandably, have become extremely defensive when it comes to raising awareness on potential suspicious activity reports. So everybody knows about the legal obligation to report SARS. I would encourage everybody that listens to this, go to your respective enforcement agency or regulator and download the latest SAR data for the previous year. Do the same for a couple of years in advance. So, we give it 3 or 4 window and look at the trajectory of the amount of SARS filed. I'm fairly confident to put my reputation out there and say it will have increased. So I use UK as an example because we're sat in the UK right now. The United Kingdom, I think in 2019 was about 500,000, and then last year it was hovering around the 800,000 mark. Now, I don't believe for one second that we see 800,000 instances of financial crime. We have a suspicion, but our suspicion is based on a number of factors, and our suspicion is based on our knowledge, our experience, and what our process and policies say that we should do. So let's think about the unintended consequences of that, right? You recruit a massive team of analysts or investigators, you set some parameters, reasonably good knowledge on what a red flag looks like. But you see a red flag, so you see a cash deposit that's based on a transaction that doesn't align to their profile. Or you're a law firm and you see a lump of savings that have appeared that doesn't fit to be the profile of your customer. You have so many customers with so limited resources that it's very challenging for you to get justification of what that transaction is. So you've now got a situation where the activity does not match what we know about the customer. What do you do in that situation? With the limited resource you have, you report it. So you're on 50-50. Now, the implication that creates is you overwhelm intelligence units. And you overwhelm intelligence units to the point that how do you even deal with close to 1 million SARS?
It's crazy.
So my that's the point I'm trying to get to, is that now we've got to a point where we're so scared to make the wrong decision. And I totally understand why. I totally understand why. Why would you? Like, what's the point? Make the decision, protect the organisation, everybody wins. And that's what leads me to the point of, well, we can just keep throwing money at this and we'll just keep fixing it and we'll just keep resolving it. But the unintended consequence is that we are overwhelming our ability to properly catch criminals.
Is there, and if there isn't, should there be some, I don't want to say the word penalty, but some level of, if you lazily or in a sort of laissez-faire attitude put together a suspicious activity report, you are wasting the time of the FIU. Should there be some comeback from that in the sense of you haven't put processes in place to think about this? Because anecdotally, I can't remember what the situation was. I remember there was a massive uptick a number of years ago, and we were speaking to people about this a lot. And people were talking to us about scenarios where SARs were submitted where there was nothing. There was nothing substantial in there other than, literally probably someone needed some bias training. There was someone seemed dodgy, which must be a massive waste of time.
Yeah. Well, let's reverse engineer the idea of what we do here. We're being quite critical, I think, and I'm gonna I'm being critical, and I actually want to challenge myself here. Because what if that decision does save a life?
Yes.
What if that decision does lead us
to
to
want to put a barrier to it?
It's a phone number. So let's think how we work better. Now, I would not want to sit here and take claim for this idea because there's been some proactive work with FIUs around the world. What they're now doing is going back to firms that are reporting suspicion and feeding back and training and development. So now we're seeing this forwards and backwards process. So we might get a reduction, small reduction, but we'll see an improvement. That's one good thing, the feedback mechanism. Now, in terms of your question about should we lower the threshold, again, why would you want to put yourself in that role if you know that you could be subjected to prosecution? That's the scary bit. So this sounds cliche because I'm on the ICA, but I can talk about the ICA because I care deeply about them. Education and knowledge at all levels, but the right competencies to do the job across every sector.
Yep.
Now, the challenge we've got is that we've got some at the top end of the scale that will be got loads of money to invest in training, knowledge and development. And then we've got some sectors that are not new to the game of compliance, but only just starting to take compliance seriously. And then maybe not seeing the connection of why investment is so important in those firms. My worry is that a relatively... No, I'm going to use the word perception. The sector that is perceived to be less well regulated gets hit with a major enforcement action when actually they should be taking proactive steps now. The reality is that law firms, trust corporate service providers around the world have taken a bit of a hammering. Sometimes rightly so. So the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, Paradise Papers, they all shone a light onto this murky world. So what is actually happening on the ground? Are we making genuine change and reform, or is this a tick box exercise to say, I've got a compliance officer? Is that compliance officer, do they have the autonomy and the authority to make meaningful change? Or do we have law firms just saying, well, I've got one, and that's kind of the bit I need to do? So for me, the key, underlining all of this, culture. Culture is so important. Every compliance officer I've ever met knows culture is important. Well, I'll set everyone a bit of a challenge, and it's a bit of fun, and try. But I want you to go back to a family member, and I want you to invoke a change, or with a friend, that will change the culture of the environment. I want you to think about how would you influence that person? How would you promote actual ethical change? Because it's not saying you'll do the right thing, it's doing the right thing. And I have a saying, and I'd like to think I made this myself, but I'm sure somebody's going to say that it was this person that said it. But culture and doing the right thing is about doing it when nobody's looking.
I like that.
And that's the noise I get a little bit around different sectors. A lot of people say they want to do the right thing, but are you doing it when nobody's looking?
Yeah. And my understanding is the SRA for the legal sector are going to be focusing a lot more on culture in the coming months and years. Have you got a view on how we get to a point where it becomes something we can measure, how we're measuring it, how we're assessing it? Because that must be going to be a huge challenge, because like you say, a lot of people have a vision, a view of what culture might look like, but then being able to demonstrate that, prove it, amend it, change it.
Well, I think there are loads of mechanisms for measuring culture, and a metric is the company itself, right? So your training record completion rates, how much people complete in training, your retention of employees and staff surveys on how they're feeling. The reality is, if all that is working, you're going to have your clients that are also going to be happy as well. And people think, how on earth are those two aligned? But risk is not just about eradicating it, because it simply doesn't exist. I could walk out of the door now and trip over something, and the only way to manage it is to sit here and not move. So I can't do that. It's about managing the risk. So if you're managing the risk properly with a risk-based approach, everyone in the organisation benefits. And your customers will benefit as well. And that is where our focus as compliance officers need to shift slightly. We shouldn't just be thinking about being the business prevention unit, but actually how we bring in the right business. So there are loads of different facets to that. Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool is a great example. Pains me to say because I'm not a Liverpool fan, but everyone can see what the culture he's created just by him leaving. And how sad people were, and you've got people coming from different parts of the organisation saying how he impacted their ability to perform their role. Not how he did the role for them, but their ability to perform the role. So there are loads of metrics. The good thing is now we're having the conversations because it's happening, and that's the positive thing.
Do you think those metrics are going to become very focused on people's opinions and people's, it's going to have to be a lot of survey based, right, to get people's sentiments as to how they feel about something. It's not going to be what other metrics are we going to have that we can put in a spreadsheet?
There are so many different components to that question. It might just not be internally as well. It could also be externally with your regulators. Perception of the regulators. I tend to find that organisations that have got some really positive and good things going on, they tend to get spoken about in wider communities outside because sort of the news filters out and stuff. In terms of absolute solid KPIs, it's a difficult thing to measure how a human being might be feeling. But you could also go as far as to say, okay, so let's be really specific about sanctions. How many policy waivers, how many breaches have we got? How many attempted sanctions have we got? How many licenses have we managed to get? How many times have we been to the enforcement agency? So actually it could be tangible to say, well, are our policies and procedures working? Yep. Policies and procedures that work will infuse the company to continue doing the right thing. So there is metric and there is data. If I come back to the SAR thing, the SAR thing's got a great opportunity to influence that. So you can look at the numbers on how many you're filing, but what does that even mean? Well, you don't know how many people are being prosecuted. You don't know what that's being done. That's why I think continuous feedback loops. Things like, what happens if you do the right thing and raise a concern in your company? What if you whistleblow? Has your company even got a whistleblowing policy? Is it independent? How many whistleblowing reports are we getting? How many times have staff members reported us externally? So there are so many facets. What it always comes back down to for me is people. Yep. So in my role and in my line of work, one of the biggest influences I see to people's careers is professional training and development and qualifications. Are the organisation giving me the space, the investment to develop myself professionally to do that? Now, the ones that I see, so we do a lot of work with bespoke clients, is you see two sides of the story. Cameras off, microphones muted, and nobody really sort of, well, I've got these emails to send. Well, hang on, the culture of your firm is telling you that that's the priority. You shouldn't feel like you have to send that. Then you speak to some students that work for some of our clients. Camera on, switched on, engaging, talking, sharing ideas, because the company have made it a priority that their investment into their education is of importance, and them as people are. And you see these people and they come back on courses a few years later, they're like, wow, I've moved up into this. Or my LinkedIn pings and it says so and so has been promoted in the same company. I think that is a measure of success. Definitely. And I guess on that point, maybe that can be our sort of last question, but if we've got people out there listening who are maybe running risk and compliance functions or are responsible for budget at law firms or other business types, and they're wondering about the merits of investing in these sorts of qualifications, what are they? What are we going to tell these people that they're going to get from investing in their team in these qualifications? Why should they do it? Well, I mean, look, the simplistic ones are, and I'm going to maybe realign and re-angle this to think from a different perspective, because they also might be thinking, why should I do it? To be able to influence my team. You are going to, of course, improve morale. And that money that you're investing into your people to make them better. Yeah. Look, I'm of the mantra of supporting people, because people are the most important aspect of any organisations. So, there are only going to be set bands for remuneration. So what else can you do? Well, not only will a professional qualification empower that individual and feel like that they've got a voice that's been heard, of course it's going to benefit your organisation, because they're going to have the competencies to manage risk and interpret issues different. They're going to feel that sense of, I have to protect the reputation of my organisation. Then the other aspect, of course, is that they want to use it for themselves, professionally develop. They may use it to springboard into another organisation and another role, but they'll always look back very fondly at that company that empowered them to do that. So it's not just always about the company that gets the benefit. It's the individual. And you will see, and I see many of these individuals that go on LinkedIn, say, I'm absolutely delighted to announce I've passed this ICA qualification. I want to thank my company. I mean, what if I ever wanted to look at another company? I'm going to look at these to say, wow, look at the culture that they've created to do that. Now, the other part of that conversation is, well, why should I? My company want to invest the money in me. Why should I go and do a professional qualification? And one of the things that I see quite a lot, and I talk to a lot of students about, is I've got the badge, I've done the course. Why am I not getting that role? So a qualification is the first step to differentiating yourself from other candidates. If you want to go down that route of a CV, it's the first step that you differentiate yourself, that you've become professionally developed and professionally accredited by the ICA. Then the feedback I get is, well, I've been to an interview and I didn't get the job. They're saying I'm not experienced enough. But I've got the badge, so hang on, why is this? So something that myself and my colleagues have worked on over the last few years is about how we make our qualifications agnostic to the level that an individual wants to work at. Now, this does not matter if you're going to an organisation that want to invest in you, that you're new to compliance, or you are a senior manager looking to influence an organisation. So you've got the different levels, whether you're looking to achieve knowledge, you want to apply the knowledge, you want to manage risk, or you want to lead risk officers. And we make those qualifications that we develop those competencies to be able to achieve that. And what I see is over the course of the learning journey, if you like, we have bits that impart knowledge and we test that knowledge. We have parts that say, well, look, we know what this is, but what happens in the real world? And then we have a point where we think, well, actually, we know what this means. We've kind of done it. But how would we manage that issue in our companies? Is it a company cultural policy? Is it policy? Or do we need to go to the regulators and start invoking change there? And it's those competencies that we hone and we develop, that when someone is sitting in a real life situation where they've got to make a decision, or they've got to influence somebody to make the right decision, or they're trying to get that job that they want, that they've developed those competencies to be able to have that conversation. And that's what investment in a qualification will do for the company. Better risk management and much stronger employee engagement.
That's fantastic. I mean, there's so many values there. It almost makes it a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting going back to one of the earlier points you made about how valued people feel, with the investment itself. And I often think, even though those things seem so, in many ways, it seems so obvious, people still disconnect the two. If someone gave you a magic item in a shopping cart that was pay this amount and your employee will feel valued, you'd probably go, well, that's easy, I'll just pay that. And you're getting this and so much more. So you can't perform the same thing over and over again and expect to get a different outcome. And I am going to be shamelessly biased here, but the environment that we create in those virtual classrooms, dependent upon the level, it's like a safe space to get things wrong. In fact, we have an immersive scenario, and why this is important is that what the immersive scenario does is, as the cohort that you've been working with for the duration of your studies, we drop into a virtual studio, and something happens. A breaking news story, a radio bulletin, an actor does something stupid, and as a team of people, we make decisions that influence the next part of the process. So if it's an imminent terrorist attack, things are going to keep happening that will impact our ability, and we have to agree as a team. If we do this, what are the outcomes? We almost like war game it. Yeah, it sounds like Apprentice or something.
It is. and so it says, right, somebody will say, right, there's a news story that says our bank has got a terrorist in it. First thing is we'll report them. Can we? Do we have the information? Oh, actually, I need to go back and investigate. So we've now found the person, but how have we found, and so on. And that's the competency part. So they actually step away and think, actually, at the senior level, the diploma level, I just thought it was about spotting red flags, but actually, it's about looking at how this issue happened in the first place. So we will look at a bank statement. We will look at a transaction monitoring system that's got errors in it. We'll find the error. Yeah, great, we can all find a problem. How's that error come to be? oh, actually, we've now got another problem because that means that we're in breach of regulation. We better prepare a report for the regulator. So we bring all of that learning to that real scenario. They go back to their places of work and they implement what they've learned. And that is how the investment in people or people that want to develop will learn and the skills that we offer at the ICA.
Amazing. So if people are listening to that thinking, this sounds right up my street, I need to get involved, where do they need to go?
So my LinkedIn always remains open for anybody, and depending on what it is, I will always route you. But the best way is get straight to the ICA website. Unfortunately, the first thing that pops up is me, and it was a lockdown haircut, and I keep asking for it to be re-recorded, and they won't do it. And I think our colleague in the room actually is responsible for recording that, so I won't.
Well, if you're what's got them there in the first place, then at least they'll feel welcome to see you again.
Just, I'm giving people a warning, like an advisory.
Yeah.
But on there's the whole suite of qualifications, and then what I would say to people is, what is it you want to achieve? We have a broad range of financial crime. We've got an AI course that launched recently, governance and risk, specialists like trade-based money laundering, correspondent banking. But think about what it is that you want to achieve. Don't just go for the badge. Don't jump in at the deep end because you want the diploma. What do I want to do? Do I want to gain knowledge? Great, we've got a range of certificates that will do that. Actually, I've got the knowledge and I want to know how I deal with these criminals or these launderers or the challenges of making decisions. Great, we've got an advanced certificate. You want to manage a team and you want to influence and you want to be an MLRO? Great, we've got a course for that. So think about what it is that you want to achieve and that will take you. And the team are fantastic. Our enrolments team will talk you through the options. If you need a little bit more subject matter expertise, myself and my colleagues, we get on the phone and we talk to people. But that's your first point of call. And yeah, look, if I haven't encouraged people to do it just through my sort of ability to share with people the difference that they make. And if anyone takes anything from this, regardless of whether you're a washer, you're something that rotates in an engine, regardless of what you think that you do or you don't do, all of us are a significant cog in the machine that stops organised crime and does the right thing.
Well, James, that's been absolutely amazing, and I think you've brought so much to life, so that's been so much value for our listeners.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
We really hope you enjoyed listening to today's podcast as much as we enjoyed recording it. If you did, please do us a huge favour and share it with a friend or a colleague. The more people we can get listening, the more time and energy we can get into recording more episodes and getting the best guests and the most interesting stories and insights. I want to say a huge thank you to the ICA for their support, to Ty and Karem here in the studio, and a massive thanks to Kat for making sure everything runs so smoothly behind the scenes. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, follow us on LinkedIn to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.